What's up, guys? It's Whisper Gamer here. Today I'm going to be reading from Wizard First Rule Chapter 2. At first, Richard stood frozen, not knowing what to do. He couldn't be sure the four men really were stalking that woman. At least not until it was too late. What business was it of his anyway? And besides, he didn't even have his knife with him. What chance did one man with no weapon have against four? He watched the woman making her way along the path. He watched the men follow. What chance did the woman have? He crouched, muscles tight and hard. His heart raced as he tried to think of what he could do. The morning sun was hot on his face, his breathing was shallow. Richard knew there was a small cutoff from Hawker's trail somewhere ahead of the woman. Hurriedly, he tried to remember exactly where. The main fork to her left continued around the lake and up the hill, to his left, to where he stood and watched. If he stayed on the main trail, he could wait for her, then tell her about the men. Then what? Besides, that was too long. The men would be on her before then. An idea began to take shape. He sprang up and started running down the trail. If he could reach her before the men caught her and before the cutoff, he could take her up the right fork. That trail led out of the trees and onto the open ledges, away from the boundary and toward the town of Heartland, toward help. If they were quick, he could hide their tracks. The men wouldn't know that the two of them had taken the side trail. They would think she was still on the main trail, at least for a while, long enough to fool them and lead her to safety. Still winded from the earlier run, Richard panted in labored breaths, running down the trail as fast as he could go. The path had quickly turned back into the trees, so at least he didn't have to worry about the men being able to see him. Shafts of sunlight flashed by as he raced along. Old pine trees lined the path, leaving a soft mat of needles to cushion his footfalls. After a time, driving himself headlong down the path, he started looking for the side trail. He couldn't be sure how far he had gone. The forest offered no view for a fix, and he didn't remember exactly where the cutoff was. It was small, and it would be easy to miss, with every bend bringing new hope that this would be the place he found the cutoff. He pushed himself on. He tried to think of what he would say to the woman. When he finally reached her, his mind raced as fast as his legs. She might think he was with their pursuers, or be frightened by him, or not believe him. He wouldn't have much time to convince her to go with him, that he wanted to help. Coming over the top of the small rise, he looked anew for the fork, but didn't see it and kept running. Now his breath came in, ragged gasps. He knew that if he didn't reach the split before she did, they would be trapped, and their only option would be to outrun the men or to fight. He was too winded for either. That thought drove him on harder. Sweat ran down his back, making his shirt stick to his skin. The coolness of the morning had turned to choking heat, though he knew it was only his exertion that made it seem that way. The forest passed in a blur to each side as he ran. Just before a sharp bend to the right, he came at last to the cutoff, almost missing it. He made a quick search for the tracks to see if she had been there and taken the small path. There were none. Relief washed over him. He dropped to his knees and sat back. On his heels, in exhaustion, trying to catch his breath, the first part had worked. He had beaten her here. Now he had to make her believe, before it was too late. Holding his right hand over a painful stitch in his side and still trying to catch his breath, he started to worry that he was going to look silly. What if it was just a girl and her brothers playing a game? He would be the fool. Everyone but him would have a good laugh. He looked down at the bite on the back of his hand. It was red and throbbed painfully. He remembered the thing in the sky. He thought about the way she had been walking, with a sense of purpose, not like a child at play. It was a woman, not a girl. He remembered the cold fear he had felt when he saw the four men warily shadowing a woman. The third strange thing to happen this morning. The third child of trouble. No, he shook his head. This was no game. He knew what he had seen. It was no game. They were stalking her. Richard came partway to his feet. Waves of heat rolled from his body. Bent over at the waist with his hands braced on his knees. He took a few deep breaths before straightening to his full height. His eyes fell on the young woman as she came around the bend in front of him. His breath caught for an instant. Her brown hair was full, lush, and long, complementing the contours of her body. She was almost as tall as he, and about the same age. The dress she wore was like none he had ever seen, almost white, cut square at the neck, interrupted only by a small leather waist pouch. The weave of the fabric was fine and smooth, almost glistening, and bore none of the lace or frills he was used to seeing, no prints or colors to distract from the way it caressed her form. The dress was elegant in its simplicity. She halted, and long, graceful folds regally trailing her gathered about her legs. Richard approached and stopped 3 strides away so as not to appear a threat. She stood straight and still, her arms at her side. Her eyebrows had the graceful arch of a raptor's wings in flight. Her green eyes came unafraid to his. The connection was so intense that it threatened to drain his sense of self. He felt that he had always known her, that she had always been a part of him, that her needs were his needs. She held him with her gaze, as surely as a grip of iron would, searching his eyes as if searching his soul, seeking an answer to something. "I am here to help you," he said in his mind. He meant it more than any thought he had ever had. The intensity of her gaze relaxed, loosening his hold on him. In her eyes he saw something that attracted him more than anything else. Intelligence. He saw it flaring there, burning in her. And through it all he felt an overriding sense of integrity. Richard felt safe. A warning flashed in his mind, making him remember why he was there, that time was dear. "I was up there," he pointed toward the hill he had been on, and "I saw you." She looked where he pointed. He looked too and realized he was pointing to a tangle of tree limbs. They couldn't see the hill because the trees blocked the view. He dropped his arm dumbly, trying to ignore the miscue. Her eyes returned to his, waiting. Richard started over, keeping his voice low. "I was up there on the hill, above the lake. I saw you walking on the path by the shore. There are some men following you." She betrayed no emotion, but continued to hold his gaze. "How many?" He thought her question strange, but answered it. 4. The color drained from her face. She turned her head, surveying the woods behind her, scanning the shadows briefly, then looked back to him once more, her green eyes searching his. "Do you choose to help me?" Except for her color, her exquisite features gave no hint as to her emotions. Before his mind could form a thought, he heard himself say yes. Her countenance softened. "What would you have us do?" "There's a small trail that turns off here. If we take it, and they stay on this one, we can be away. And if they follow our trail, I'll hide our tracks." He was shaking his head, trying to reassure her. "They won't follow. Look, there's no time." "If they do," she cut him off. "Then what is your plan?" He studied her face a moment. "Are they very dangerous?" She stiffened. "Very." The way she spoke the word made him have to force himself to breathe again. For an instant he saw a look of blind terror pass across her eyes. Richard ran his fingers through his hair. "Well, the small trail is narrow and sheer. They won't be able to surround us." "Do you have a weapon?" He answered by shaking his head no. Too angry with himself for forgetting his knife to voice it out loud, she nodded. "Let's be quick then." They didn't talk once the decision had been made. Not wanting to give away their location, Richard hurriedly concealed their tracks and motioned her to go first, so he would be between her and the men. She didn't hesitate. The folds of her dress flowed behind as she moved lush young evergreens of the fen pressed tight at their sides, making the path a narrow dark green walled route cut through the brush and branches. They could see nothing around them. Richard checked behind as they went, though he couldn't see far. At least what he could see was clear. She went swiftly without any encouragement from him. After a time, the ground started rising and becoming rockier, and the trees thinned, offering a more open view. The trail twisted along deeply shaded cuts in the terrain and across leaf-strewn ravines. Dry leaves scattered at their passing. Pines and spruce gave way to hardwood trees, mostly white birch. And as the limbs swayed overhead, little patches of sunlight danced the forest floor. The birches, white chunks with black spots, made it look as if hundreds of eyes were watching the two pass. Other than the raucous racket of some ravens, it was a very quiet, peaceful place. At the base of a granite wall that the path followed, he motioned to her, putting a finger over his lips, letting her know they had to step carefully to avoid making sounds that would echo. Their location. Whenever a raven cawed, he could hear it reverberate through the hills. Richard knew this place. The shape of the rock wall could carry a sound for miles. He pointed to the moss-covered round rocks littering the flat forest floor. He showed her that he meant for the two of them to step on the rocks to avoid snapping sticks hidden under the leaf litter. He moved some leaves to show her sticks hidden there and pretended to break them, then cupped his hands to his ears. She nodded her understanding, lifted her skirts with one hand, and began to step up onto the rocks. He touched her arm to make her look back again, and mimed slipping and falling, to let her know she had to be careful because the moss was slippery. She smiled and nodded again before hurrying on. Her smile was unexpected, and it warmed him, softening the edge of his fear. Richard allowed himself a small dose of confidence about their escape, and he stepped from the one mossy rock to another. As the path climbed steadily upward, the trees thinned more. The rock taking over from the soil offered trees infrequent opportunity to put down root. Soon the only trees grew in crevices and were gnarled, twisted and small, wanting to offer no purchase to the wind that could pull them from their meager anchoring. They slipped quietly out of the trees and onto the ledges. The path wasn't always clearly marked, and there were many false trails. She often had to turn to him, and he directed her by pointing or with a nod of his head. Richard wondered what her name was, but his fear of the four men kept him from talking. Even though the trail was steep and hard, he didn't have to slow on her account. She was a strong climber and quick. He saw that she wore good boots of soft leather, the kind of boots worn by one used to traveling. It had been well over an hour since they had come out of the trees, climbing steadily upward into the sun. They were heading east onto the ledges before the trail cut back to the west later. The men, if they had followed, would have to look into the sun to see them. Richard kept them crouched as low as possible and checked over his shoulder often as they climbed, scanning for any sign of the men. When he had seen them by Trunk Lake, they were staying well hidden, but it was too open out here for them. He saw nothing and started to feel better. They weren't being followed. The men were nowhere to be seen and were probably miles down Hawker's Trail. Okay guys, I'm gonna end it right there for today, and I will finish it probably by Friday. I'm still gonna get the other chapter of Twilight out tomorrow. So right now, that's my plan, and maybe another eating video this weekend. I hope you guys enjoyed. Peace.